Hello, and welcome to the sixth and final episode of Water Solutions for Our Warmer World. This afternoon, our topic is biodiversity, water, and climate change in the Southwest. And we have a great panel of experts to talk to you about this today. We're also going to have an excellent moderator, Ben Wilder, who will be joining me shortly. On behalf of the Arizona Institutes for Resilience, the Office of Research, Innovation, and Impact at the University of Arizona, and our co-sponsors, the Water Resources Research Center and the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kathy Jacobs, and I'm the Director of the Center for Climate Adaptation Science and Solutions within the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. Before we get started, we have a few Zoom tips for you. First of all, please use the question and answer area at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit questions for the panelists. We won't be responding to them right away, but rather we'll accumulate those questions and sort through them and include them in the discussion that happens at the end of our episode. We are recording this primarily because we plan to post this online after the event. So we just want to make sure you know that. And we also are looking to learn from how we do each one of these. And so we will be sending you a follow-up questionnaire after the event. And we hope that you'll be able to give us some feedback about how you like this event or the entire series, because honestly, this is the last of this series, and we're interested in knowing whether we should do this kind of thing in the future. We're really happy that we have a great set of participants with us today. We had over 200 people register. I'm not sure how many will actually join, but we're really glad that you're interested in this topic. Before we begin our discussion, I just wanted to acknowledge that this entire set of presentations is dedicated to the memory of Jim Shuttleworth, a Regents professor who passed away about a year ago. He worked for several decades with us and played a major role in understanding the role of the water cycle and how it relates to climate change. There's more about his life, family, and a video about his contributions in the link that's in the chat. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of background before we get going with this panel. This is a topic that is incredibly near and dear to my heart. I care a lot about what's going on with biodiversity, and I see it as strongly linked to climate change and water issues. The panel that we have for you this afternoon is actually not primarily climate scientists, and so I'm going to just say a little bit about the climate background before we launch the rest of the panel. Could I have the next slide? So this is the climate, water, and biodiversity in the Southwest 101 slide. Obviously, it's going to get hotter. And as it gets hotter, stream flow is likely to be reduced. But we also have to acknowledge that in the context of climate change, we may very well see extreme flooding events. Both of those things can affect riparian habitat, which of course is incredibly important for biodiversity. There's also an expected reduction in groundwater recharge, particularly in snowmelt dominated areas. And that's important as well because groundwater supports riparian habitat. Evapotranspiration generally will increase, and that's primarily because the temperature is rising, but it can only increase if there's enough moisture in the soil that it can be pulled out. And so the evapotranspiration may be limited by how much water is in the soil, but in general, when it gets hotter, you'll lose more water to the atmosphere. It will be drier on average, as we understand it, with the potential for longer and hotter drought periods, but punctuated, as I mentioned before, with extreme flooding events. There's a likelihood of cascading effects, for example, heat waves, forest fires, air quality problems, sedimentation, all have impacts on biodiversity. And so there's serious implications for ecosystems, human health, and historically disadvantaged populations, which is why this topic is of great interest to me. Next slide, please. Many of you may be aware that Audubon has done an assessment actually of bird species in a very broad study, but they've actually done it county by county, and it's called Survival by Degrees. 389 bird species on the brink. I'm also a birder, another reason I care about this, but I recommend that you take a look at this report if you're interested. Next. And finally, I just want to mention that not only is biodiversity important because it's such a part of the landscape that we care about, but also it's part of our quality of life, and that's part of our economy. And so if we care about the property values and we care about recreation, we care about quality of life, all of those things are connected to biodiversity. And I will turn it over now to Ben Wilder, who is going to introduce the panelists. Ben Wilder is the director of the Desert Laboratory in Tumamoc Hill at the University of Arizona, and he is also a part of the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. So Ben, take it away, and thank you so much for agreeing to moderate today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, Kathy. And thanks for setting the stage for us in terms of this really important topic. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us. It's great to see many of you with us this afternoon. So, you know, one of the ways I think about the importance of water in the desert, and especially in our riparian systems, is water is life in the desert, right? That is the reason people settled in this region. You know, in my work here as the director of the Desert Laboratory on Tumamoc Hill, this space that is part of the University of Arizona and part of our larger community is a cultural landscape. And it's a cultural landscape because it's a large volcanic mountain adjacent to the Santa Cruz River, which perennially had river at the base of its slopes for thousands of years. The name of our city, Tucson, comes from Chukson, the Atum word, meaning black base. And it's at that black base and that volcanic uplift that created this source of perennial water that then allowed for so much life, not just human, to really proliferate here in this region. And as we know, and as Kathy did a great job summarizing, there's a lot of uncertainty as well as very clear trends in alarming directions regarding such a fundamental life-giving source in our region and in the desert, which is water. So that's why I think this is a great topic to focus on in the conclusion to what's been a really impactful series, and really honored to be able to hosting this panel today. So we're gonna, the way we're gonna flow is that we're gonna have some opening remarks from Giselle Ramon Sabran, and then we're gonna have a series of panelists share their expertise. Then we're gonna reconvene for some kick off the conversation, question and answer period, and then we'll get into the question and answers from all of you. So just to reiterate, if you have questions as they develop during the presentations, please insert them into the question and answer box, and then we'll get to as many as we possibly can as we go along. So I'd first like to introduce and welcome Giselle. Giselle Ramon Sabran is Tonatem and from the WAC district, also referred to as the San Javier district of the Tonatem. She is currently a doctoral candidate in American Indian Studies with a minor in journalism at the University of Arizona, and recently faculty in the Tonatem Studies program at Tonatem Community College. Giselle is also an information specialist with ARA or NOR Lab, closely working with Kitt Peak National Observatory. Giselle, it's great to have you with us. It's been really fun to and enlightening to work with you over the last couple years and to follow the work that you've been doing for your doctoral research. And we had the opportunity to talk the other day and how you're just so directly working with students now. It's awesome. It's really impactful work. And And thank you for, joining us today and helping us set the stage and kind of giving us an important context of how to understand, that importance of water in the desert.
Thank you, Ben, and happy to be here. So skugtash anyap jugi Jasaw Ramon Sabran Chapwak Amachit. So good day. My name is Jasaw Ramon Sabran, and I come from the Sanavir community on the Thanatam Nation. And what I wanted to do was actually start with an excerpt from a poem written by Dr. Ophelia Cepeda, who's Thanatam and the only Thanatam professor at the University of Arizona. And so that poem is the excerpt is from Proclamation, and it goes, it should be unnecessary for sticky notes to remind us what a desert place is, a place dependent on rains of summer, light dusting of snow, the rarity of dry beds as rebel rivers. It is real desert people who lift their faces upward with the first sign of moisture. They know how to inhale properly, recognizing the aroma of creosote in the distance. Relieved, the cycle is beginning again. These people are to be commended. And I started with this not only because we're talking about water, but to set the mood and set the place, and for you to understand where we're situated within Tucson. And, it's the home of my ancestors and where we've lived for time immemorial, and just how sacred land and water is to us. And as on the screen, you see the O'odham word for land is shrutak. And I have a real connection to it. You can go to the next slide. Being from Sanavir and having generation upon generation of my family being farmers and using the Santa Cruz River to be able to, water our fields and, take care of it and respect it. And here are some photos, my great grandparents, Frank and Anselmo Rios, with some of their children. And the little girl is my grandma. And, I grew up listening to stories from her and her talking to me and telling me what the Santa Cruz River used to look like once upon a time. It doesn't look like how it does today. It used to be very lush and shady and cool and green. And, I loved hearing those stories growing up and her talking to me and telling me about those. And also to our respect, our creator Itoy put us here to take care of the land. We don't own the land, we are stewards of it, and we, are here to respect it, to, make sure that we're utilizing it properly. And that's not only for the water, it goes for our plants, it goes for, how we, treat animals, everything, with the utmost respect. And so, unfortunately, within history, our water was taken from us by outside entities and used and not respected the way that, we were taught to respect it. And my great grandfather, Frank Rios, was very big on using the ancestral ways when it comes to canal systems of our ancestors, the Huhukam, and being able to farm and teach others about that. And so you see in one of the pictures, he's there with non-O'odham and sharing how, he's been successful and having crops and everything else. And, really commending him for sharing that knowledge. And the picture below is again of my grandma showing how squash and how big squash can grow. Because a lot of times there's this, I guess, idea that nothing grows in the desert. We don't have water, so nothing's able to flourish, which isn't true at all. You can go to the next slide. And so, here's a picture of Sanavir and what it looked like once upon a time. And, we've always been a farming community. And, when the water was taken from, these outside entities that used it up, we had to stop farming. We had to quit, what we'd known for forever. But then thanks to elders coming together and saying that this isn't okay, that we need to be able to farm, and fighting back and standing up for what we believe in as O'odham, and you know, filing a lawsuit, which resorted in SWARSA, the Southern Arizona Water Rights Settlement Act, and then even having that amended later on because we still weren't okay with it, and really standing up, you know, and having those individuals, some who are no longer with us anymore, you know, to be able to do that, it's monumental for us. And we are able once again to be farming and produce crops and, you know, have that livelihood. You can go to the next slide. And so I wanted to show a map, you know, and the word Oitak is farm fields. So throughout this original traditional map, you can see, you know, how many Oitak farm fields that we had, and how it looked for, you know, for us. And also too, it, you know, I always hear stories, even from my mom when she was a little girl, telling me how lush and how much, you know, mesquite we had. And at one point, you know, this road now that's totally clear, there's no mesquite in sight. Once upon a time, that's all there was. And it, you couldn't even walk through it. That's how, you know, lush and abundant though the mesquite were from have the water under the ground, because the word walk translates to where the water goes under, and that's referring to our aquifers. So, you know, in the area, discovering the aquifers and seeing how the water, the way it goes is the water, what you'd see the water, then it disappear, and then it show up somewhere else. And so that's the name walk. And you know, today a lot of this hasn't changed. We are one community. A long time ago, we used to be many communities, but we're one community, one district today. And as I mentioned, you know, farming is everything to us. Us being able to have that traditional ecological knowledge and share it and continue it, and is very important and vital for our future generations. Next slide. And my grandma, two of my grandmas actually are both in these news articles, and you know, we're at the forefront for speaking up and talking about how water needs to come back here. And you know, and in my research, finding these and seeing them, it's just makes me, you know, feel that I'm on the right path to what my dissertation research is on, which is the history of land and water in the Sanavir district and community. But still, you know, again, speaking up and saying, hey, you know, something needs to be done, and never backing down and continuing to fight and fight until we were able to have that settlement and we were able to bring water back to Sanavir. And, you know, again, being able to do something that was taken away from us. And I have a couple quotes here. You know, before the white man's dam and groundwater pump strangled the Santa Cruz, they said a small dam stretched across the shallow river, meaning the Santa Cruz. It diverted water into ditches to soak the fields where most Sanavir families grew squash, corn, beans, and peas. And that's what my great grandparents did. And for my grandma to share that, and then even my other grandma, you know, to stand up for that and really fight for it, it's important to know that. Next slide. We're able to see the water flow again in the Santa Cruz, in the Sanavir area. And actually went out a couple weeks ago. I took a group of students from Utah that came to visit. And, you know, I never thought in my lifetime that I would see this. And it is beautiful, and it's very, you know, sacred. And we had a ceremony to honor this and recognize that, you know, the waters is starting to flow again. And within the last few years, seeing, you know, this dry riverbed, and now here we are a couple years later, and it's lush, there's greenery, you know, you see all of this, and it's nature doing what it, you know, what it does best, and bringing this back. And you know, again, I wanted you to see this and understand just how meaningful and how sacred that is for us. And, you know, again, for our future generations to know this and see this, because it was always something of the past, and you would see it in pictures, you'd hear it in stories, but now seeing that for myself, for my own eyes, you know, it really brings a tear to my eye, because it's so beautiful and, you know, important to us. And like I said, I took this a couple weeks ago and I hadn't been out there in quite some time. And so to see it and, know that it's flowing and the water has come back, and, definitely on our radar as a community, and making sure that it's taken care of and making sure that it continues to flow. And, we sing for it, and, we again have ceremonies and, acknowledge it and pay our respect to it as well. So with that, Dahuge, thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Thank you so much, Giselle. You communicated a lot there in a really short amount of time. And I love where you ended, because that's going to be a perfect place for us to come back to on that resiliency of water coming back due to a lot of effort. So we'll have you join us again in a little bit when we get into the question and answer period. So thank you. At this point, we're going to transition and have some additional brief presentations from our other panelists. I'd like to first introduce Dr. Julie Stromberg. Dr. Julie Stromberg is Professor Emeritus with the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. She is a plant ecologist and botanist who specializes in riparian and wetland ecosystems. During her time at Arizona State University, she studied the ways in which human activities in arid regions influence riparian plant populations, communities, and landscapes. Julie, thanks so much for joining us, and I look really forward to hearing what you're going to share with us now.
Hey, thank you very much. And that was a very moving introduction about the Santa Cruz River. That was lovely. So I'm delighted to be here today to answer questions and to share a little bit of my own personal history. I am, as you just heard, a botanist and a plant ecologist. And I recently retired after 3 decades at ASU. And I owe the pathway I took to my parents. My father was a professor and my mother was an avid gardener. And this tomboy fused the two to become a scientist. And I should say, I kept my father's last name, Stromberg. It means mountain stream in Swedish. And I studied them and love them. So that was kind of fitting. So I am very grateful to have had the opportunity to study desert rivers of the American Southwest over several decades. And these included times of extreme drought, as well as some extreme flooding when I first moved to Arizona. And my studies have taken me to free-flowing, undammed rivers, such as the San Pedro and the Hassayampa. They've also taken me to others more heavily impacted by human impacts, such as the Salt River and the Santa Cruz River. And during my studies, I've met trees such as Fremont cottonwood, velvet mesquite, Gooding willow. And I've learned about their needs for particular depths to groundwater to maintain themselves, or for particular types of flood regimes to regenerate the next generation. And I've also met the shrubby tree salt cedar, who is one that we invited here decades ago from Eurasia to carry out some particular functions. And at first, like others, I was a bit wary of her abundance and spread throughout some of the rivers. But through my research and that of others, I came to understand that with her deep roots, small leaves, salt extruding glands, generalist reproductive strategy, she was simply well adapted to the changes that we were making to the rivers through our dams, our groundwater pumps, our agricultural chemicals, our cows. I also learned that through research that she, like other trees and shrubs, is sustaining bird life and insect life, fixing carbon and providing shade. So intellectually, it's been rewarding to disentangle these patterns and understand the reciprocal relationships between plants and their environment. And emotionally, it's been sort of sad and also frustrating to witness so much loss and so much change and read about what was. But I will say that since retiring, I've recovered some optimism about the resilience of riparian biota. My partner and I live in South Phoenix, And we've been restoring our own patch of urban riparian land using salt river irrigation water. We're mostly growing a lot of velvet mesquite, and we harvest it and use it for the flower for food. But whoever else wants to show up, we're fine with that too. And so part of this optimism lies in detaching a little bit from trying to protect everything that was there in the past, and embracing the ongoing changes in composition of the plant communities. It also lies in understanding that plants collectively, including the newcomers, as well as the longtime residents, are capturing carbon, slowing the rate of climate change, and providing other functions that we value. And as the stresses on the vegetation increase, as you heard about, hotter temperatures, prolonged drought, more intense rains, greater wind, as these stresses increase, I've become convinced that the best path forward is to shift away from an adversarial relationship with plants. There's a lot of fear and hate. I don't use that word loosely, directed against plants. And I would like us to consider that the plants who migrated from somewhere else, whether that be a tropical zone to the south or somewhere else, may actually be part of the solution. So that's a bit controversial, but that's where I am right now. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Julie. I have a feeling that's gonna provoke some good question and answer fodder when we get into. I know I have a lot of questions related, especially to invasive species and salt cedar, as you mentioned, and thinking about how we can relate to them moving forward, and other species as well. So perfect comments to get us going here. I next want to introduce my friend, Dr. Jenny Duberstein. Jenny is director of the Sonoran Joint Venture with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She is a wildlife biologist and conservation social scientist who has spent her professional career working to build partnerships for bird and habitat conservation across the United States and Northwest Mexico. I've had the great pleasure to work with Jenny in a number of projects, including on the board of the Next Generation Sonoran Desert Researchers, and have been continuously impressed by the networks and partnerships that Jenny's created and continue to support, doing awesome work. So Jenny, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm grateful for the invitation to be here to join you. My name is Jenny Duberstein. My pronouns are she, her. And like Ben said, I direct a binational bird and habitat conservation partnership called the Sonoran Joint Venture. I'm a wildlife biologist, an ornithologist by training, and also a conservation social scientist. And when I think about the ways that we need to work together to address the really complex conservation issues throughout the world, what it really comes down to for me is the idea that conservation is about behavior. And in the context of bird conservation, in most cases, we're not trying to change bird behavior to protect the birds, although occasionally we are trying to change bird behavior. We're mostly trying to change human behavior. And we want people to start doing something. We want them to keep on doing something, or most frequently, we want them to stop doing something. And so what I'm really interested in is understanding what drives that human behavior, and how we can work together to work within the context of people's values and beliefs, to build a world that is better for birds, but better for people also. In my work with the Sonoran Joint Venture, what we do is bring partners together from federal and state agencies, from nonprofits, from academia, from private industry, from the tribes, from private citizens, to think about how we can work together to conserve the unique birds and habitats of the southwestern US and northwestern Mexico. The Sonoran Joint Venture has a really big geography. It includes Arizona from the Mogollon Rim south. It includes Southern California and the Channel Islands. And in Mexico, it includes the states of Baja California Sur, the Mexican Pacific Islands, the Gulf of California and all of its islands, Sonora, Sinaloa, and Nayarit, and parts of Chihuahua and Durango from the Sierra Madre to the west. So it's a huge area with a really incredible diversity of habitats, of birds, of people, and of conservation challenges. And our job with the joint venture is to think big picture, to think at the landscape level, to focus on things that are really too big for one agency, for one organization, for one state, for one country to address on their own. And what the Sonoran Joint Venture does is help facilitate discussion. We promote collaboration. We help coordinate things like conservation planning and action. And we provide support to our partners in a bunch of different ways, everything from providing funding through our small grants program to capacity building and training, to meeting facilitation, to travel support, just a lot of different ways to help our partners undertake the excellent work on the ground that they do. I don't think I need to tell anybody here today that this part of the world that we live in is really diverse and unique, whether we're talking about birds, mammals, plants, insects, fish, or people. It's a region of starting and ending points where a lot of different major ecosystems come together. And it's also a region of extremes. Because of the juxtaposition of the Rocky Mountains from the north, the Sierra Madre from the south, the Sonoran Desert from the west, the Chihuahuan Desert from the east, and even influences from the Great Basin and from the Great Plains, a lot of the bird species in this part of the world are at the northern, the southern, the eastern, or the western extremes of their range. Bird distribution isn't the only thing that's extreme here, though. Our summer temperatures are extreme. This time of year, the difference between the daytime and nighttime temperatures is extreme. Our rainfall is extreme. It's extremely low, and when it comes, it can be extremely intense. Our rivers are extreme, many going from completely dry at the surface for most of the year to raging torrents when the rains come. And in addition to living at the extreme limits of their geographic ranges, many bird species in this area are living near the extremes of what's viable for them in terms of temperature and water for their daily survival, for the survival of their food and their shelter sources, and for the survival of their eggs and chicks. Even small shifts in temperature and water availability can have drastic impacts on birds, which rely on our changeable riparian systems for survival. Birds use everything from our medium and larger rivers like the Colorado, the Santa Cruz, the San Pedro, to temporal washes that may be wet for only a couple of weeks out of every year. The projected changes in temperature, in rainfall, and in water availability in this region are a major cause for concern when it comes to bird conservation, of course, but for all wildlife, for people that live in this region as well. And what we try to do, what the Sonoran Joint Venture aims to do, is bring partners together across borders to try to come up with creative ways to address these problems and other problems of this magnitude, help find ways to build resiliency into our conservation efforts to hopefully allow us to be more likely to be able to adapt to what is an increasingly uncertain future.
Thank you, Jenny. That was fantastic. You hit on some key topics there, and the litany of extreme elements that are just inherent to our region is an area I've been thinking a lot about recently, and where do those thresholds exist within that? I think we'll be able to get into that in a bit, so thanks very much. Last but certainly not least, I want to next introduce my friend Osvaldo Hernandez. Dr. Osvaldo Hernandez is director of the Coastal Solutions Fellows Program at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology at Cornell University. The goal of his program is to build conservation capacity along the Pacific coast from Mexico to Chile for communities and shorebirds. Quite the geographic scope there, Osvaldo. I don't get to see you as much as we used to when you were based here more locally, but it's sure great to see you now. And I know you're just continuing to do excellent work. So thanks for joining us and sharing what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben, and thanks for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here today. And so yeah, before joining the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I used to work for a nonprofit organization called Pro Natura Noroeste in Mexico. I still collaborate with Pro Natura, and I had been working on the Colorado River Delta for about 20 years. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And of course, shorebirds and the Pacific Flyway is always on my mind, but my heart, it's always in the Colorado River Delta. And yes, we have been hearing out rivers in this region, in the Sonoran Desert, in northwestern Mexico and the southwestern United States, are already stressed out, right? A lot of them are over allocated, and water was not allocated for environmental uses. So it's been all diverted, no, and allocated for human consumption. And so in many of the main rivers, not only the Colorado, but the Yaqui, the Mayo, flows do not reach the sea, or not always, no? And this has created a lot of impacts on deltas, on estuaries, and on the sea also, no, on coastal areas. And the infrastructure, dams are also affecting the hydrological regime, some of the important qualities of water that supports life, for example, temperature, and also sediment regimes have been affected. No? And so in getting in particular into the Colorado River, to start with, no, the river, it's over allocated at least 16%, and this is getting worse every year because there is less water in the river. And the river has not reached the sea regularly since the 1950s. And this created huge impact in the Delta. Now, about 85% of the wetlands have been lost in the Delta, with impacts in biodiversity, but also you can imagine impacts on the local communities and cultures. No? The Kukapa people, the indigenous group of the Colorado River Delta, they have been suffering because of these landscape changes. Their culture it's adapted to a delta with water, no? They are fishermen, so it has created a lot of struggles for them. And what is surprising is that this system still survives. There is a lot of resiliency, and something that we have learned is that there have been unintentional water uses, no? And we have seen that different types of these unintentional flows have different value. In the delta and in desert areas, no? And the ecological function of these flows depend on their characteristics. For example, agricultural drainage that is brackish, and you know it's sometimes is not valued or is considered secondhand water, can be very valuable ecologically, no, and supports marshes, no. Riparian system, they do require more fresh water in the location of in-stream flows. And we have learned also, no, that these unintentional flows support really important wildlife populations. So recently, you know, a report by Audubon has identified that in the Delta, there are about 14 to 17 million migratory birds using the Delta during a spring and fall migration. And also we know that the largest population of the Yuma Ridgeway whale is protected both in the US and Mexico. It's an endemic subspecies of the lower Colorado and Delta. The largest population, about 75%, lives in the Colorado River Delta. No? But with increasing water demand and climate change, this biodiversity is more endangered than ever. We heard about the effects of climate change in the basin. It's probably, we're not really in a drought, but it has been more of an aridification process, no, with climate change. And the question is, well, how can we fix this? No, that's what we're trying to figure out. No, and I think there are some lessons learned. No, we need collaborative solutions that include stakeholders at the very local level, working with farmers and with communities and with the tribes, and all the way up, no, to decision makers at the national level, for example, reaching by national agreements between the US and Mexico. And the solutions need to be comprehensive. Now, if we're trying just to address the environmental component, probably it's not going to work. We need to address this in a comprehensive fashion, addressing shortage, water conservation, structural deficit in water allocations, at the same time that we are addressing the environment. And the good news is that there's been significant progress. You probably heard about Minute 319 and Minute 323 of the Binational Water Treaty between Mexico and the US. Together, these two agreements have been able to allocate nearly 450,000 acre-feet of water for environmental restoration in the Delta. Minute 323 is happening now and extends until 2026. And it allows for river flows in the Delta for 6 months between May and October of this year. So that was great news. And you probably heard of the Pulse Law of 2014 that allowed the Colorado River to reconnect with the Gulf of California for the first time in 20 years. But more important, no, it allowed local communities to reconnect with the river. For some, the younger generations, it was the first time that they saw the river with water. And I think, in my perspective, this started to shift the relationship that we have with nature in the basin. No? And also we have learned that restoration is more complicated than just adding water, especially in a system that like the Colorado, that it's so managed. And we have seen that the best restoration outcomes are happening in places where there is active work, no? That includes some removal of exotic species, only in places where native trees are going to be established. It includes the allocation of water strategically, to maintain these sites. And also, good news, this is working, not only in the Delta, but in the lower Colorado and in other places. And the restoration work, the allocation of fresh water, but also efforts to maintain agricultural return flows, for example, to the Cienega de Santa Clara and the Hardy River, as well as the efforts to dedicate treated wastewater. This has allowed the conservation of over 40,000 acres of wetlands and the restoration of about 1,500 acres of riparian forest. And birds are responding. For example, in the Hardy River, the Yuma Ridgeway rails and least bitterns have grown exponentially in the last 15 years in response to the allocation of the treated effluent. Nesting water birds have gone from only about 160 birds to over 2,200 birds in the estuary in response to the allocation of in-stream flows since 2014. And the abundance and diversity of birds is 85% and 36% higher in restored sites than in unrestored sites. No? And of course, these are only the first steps, and this is a long-term work that needs to continue. Water should be legally allocated for environmental purposes from all different sources, including return flows and treated effluent. And every step should involve local stakeholders and communities, but also high-level decision makers. No? We need this to guarantee that there is a solid governance structure to secure the maintenance of these outcomes in the long term. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Osvaldo. A great panorama there of all the different tools that you're able to utilize. And we're going to get into more of those right now. So at this point, I'd like to welcome back all of our speakers to please turn your videos back on and join us. And then I'm going to kick us off into a conversation here. Remember, please feel free to put questions you all may have into the chat, and we'll try to get to them as we can. So to kick us off, and Osvaldo, you just kind of hit on it as well. So when we think about the future of our riparian corridors in the desert, one of the primary sources for water in these rivers going forward, in many ways, especially in urban areas, is treated effluent. So I'm curious what you think are the challenges, concerns, or opportunities of using what is likely to be the most reliable source of water to maintain our riparian systems. Julie, do you mind starting us off with this question?
Oh, sure, that's fine. Yes, the release of effluent certainly can result in gains in acreage of riparian forest and meadow, and the Santa Cruz is an excellent example of that potential. But it's depending on, say, for the geomorphic context of the river, the use of effluent may be less effective. For example, or at least the challenges are a little more daunting. And for example, in the Salt River channel in Phoenix, which is the river closest to me right now, the channel has become quite entrenched and channelized. So you have this very narrow channel that's now disconnected from its developed and urbanized floodplain. So while releasing effluent into that channel is can and should be used to provide a water source for the riparian vegetation, we also need to pay attention to how water is functioning to sustain riparian vegetation throughout that mile wide swath through which the river once roamed. And so, for example, maybe we want to use effluent not just within the river channel, but replace some of the existing green spaces, of which there are many, which for the most part, we have like acres of sod. We're growing golf courses, we're growing parks. That park near my house is just this vast expanse of sod. Even school grounds, it's grass. It's like, nothing against grass, I love grass. But if we're talking about diversity, can we use effluent or other sources of water before it reaches the treatment plant to increase riparian biodiversity within the urban zone? So it can provide functions such as increasing bird life, feeding us, shading us, cooling us, a variety, turn a sort of single function landscape into a multifunctional landscape. This is what I would like to see happen.
Yeah, thank you. Osvaldo, you mentioned in your remarks the role of effluent. I'm curious, how you see that resource as kind of nuanced and perhaps controversial as it is fitting into the larger picture.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important source, as you mentioned, and as Julie mentioned. And one critical thing is it's a scarce resource that there is going to be competition. There is already competition for it, as Julie was describing. But for example, in Baja California, and especially in Mexicali, there is a market for it. Industry are purchasing treated effluent because they need it. Farmers are purchasing treated effluent because they can use it. So it's not anymore. It's for granted that this effluent will go to streams, right? We need to make sure that it's guaranteed for that purpose. That's one element. And the other is that we need to make sure that it's of the right quality, right? That we are assuming that wastewater treatment plants are going to function properly, but it might not be the case. And probably the largest challenge could be with biological demand, that it's too loaded with organic matter. And in these rivers or wetlands that are already stressed out with reduced flows, it could be a challenge. So we just need to be careful about that aspect. No?
Yes.
One thing you mentioned there is something that my friend Michael Bogan mentioned recently, is that if we're not, while effluent may just seem like an unlimited resource right now, if we're not careful and don't think about actually allocating it for biodiversity or wildlife, it could be just like you said, it could get to a point where, wow, all the effluent we were depending on as a mechanism for bringing water to our riparian corridors may disappear. Jenny, I'm curious if in your work, if you interact with that topic much.
Yeah, definitely. In agreeing, no disagreements with anything that was said, but I think sort of the flip side of that is that water is scarce. Water is going to get even more scarce, and there are absolutely issues with it, and we need to think about how it's being used. But it's really important. And in addition to things that we see, like the Santa Cruz in Tucson, that's a great example of using effluent for restoration. There are things like sweetwater wetlands, and I know in Northwest Mexico, there are some examples of constructed wetlands that are used to help treat water, as secondary treatment, and provide filtration before it goes through or after it goes through some initial cleaning, and then it can be put back into the system. And in the process of doing that, it also creates really important habitat for birds and other wildlife. One of the best spots to bird within Tucson city limits, two of the best spots to bird are probably two wastewater treatment constructed wetlands.
Yeah, interesting. Switching gears a little bit, kind of on the same topic, at this point, there have been numerous restoration projects in riparian ecosystems in the greater Southwest. What have we learned from studying and participating in the successes and also some of the failures of ecosystem restoration projects in riparian areas? I think this is a topic that probably most cohesively unites the four of you in your work. And Giselle, I'm curious, I'm especially interested in the restoration project that you actually discussed in your words, carried out on the Walk District. What have been some of the takeaways from this effort, and from your point, both in terms of the opportunities it's presented, but also maybe some of the challenges in getting to this point, or where you see it going next?
Yeah, so in Sanavir, we have our walk Hikthun, and Hikthun translates to kind of like a divide or like a deep, narrow wash gully. And it was a community that actually came together, and from the Sanavir district vision that was created, wanting to have areas within our district boundaries to be able to have riparian area and be able to do something with the land. And so through this effort of the community coming together, working with the district, in 1996, they applied and were given a grant from the Arizona Water Project Fund. And so we have these riparian areas down by the Santa Cruz, and it's a beautiful area. And it's for us, as meaning community members, sacred space for us to use and be able to utilize. And we actually have our Young Women's Gathering down at this place. We've had other events as well, and it gives us, meaning us younger generations, a glimpse into what the Santa Cruz looked like once upon a time. And it's a long time ago. It wasn't as wide as it is today with the erosion. It was a lot skinnier. And like I'd mentioned, stories from my grandma talking about the cottonwood and going and picking willow and making willow baskets and the shade and the coolness, and even talking about washing, clothes and items within the Santa Cruz. And so us younger generations, by having this Hikthun riparian area, and we get a chance to step into that and be able to experience what our ancestors lived and had every single day. And so that's a benefit for us to have that. Another benefit is also to all the animals. They love that area. And actually, when I took that group of Utah students along with help with the natural resources department from Sanavir district, we're just out there talking, looking at the water flow. And then all of a sudden there was about 50 javelinas that just were not far from us, just run across. And so, and even when we had our Young Women's Gathering, running into wildlife and them utilizing that area as well. And, when the water does get turned on at the riparian area, again, it's just, water is sacred. And for us to have this space and be able to utilize it and have all this is very beautiful. And I don't think enough of maybe our community members utilize it, but at the same time, though, it's there and it's a place for us, which is really great. And, and we do offer tours through the Sanavir district to go down there. So that's how I was able to take this group of students from Utah. And it's again, something really great for us to have. And I just think we need to continue educating our youth and our younger generations about it, and having them understand the importance of it. Because within my research and what I'm doing, it's super important, because unfortunately knowledge is being lost with folks that are passing away. And so I'm trying to capture as much as I can. So then that way we can kind of start filling in these gaps and having tribal members understand, again, the importance, the sacredness, why they need to know this information. So then that way, our TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, can continue on. And, really trying to make it so we don't have something happen again where our livelihood is taken away from us. In this case, it'd be our knowledge gets lost. We don't want that again. So I encourage those of you, if you're interested, reach out to me. And if you want to go on a tour and go down to the Hikthun, I can definitely help arrange that and make that possible.
Just was the Hikthun there when you were a child, or is that a relatively recent space? I'm just thinking about how long it takes for some of these restoration projects.
So when it was started, I was a little kid. I was in elementary school. And so I, even with the Sanavir co-op farm, I remember it when I was a kid and driving through, and it was just really kind of nothing. And we really had to go in and fix the land because of toxins, pesticides that were used once upon a time on our land. And so it took time to get it to where it is now. And in my background, this is actually the co-op and how lush it is, and how green it can be. And so, yeah, I remember it from being a kid, and, it was just these little cottonwoods, they were just babies. And then all these years later, seeing them and just seeing what can flourish in the desert, and having, again, youth and others that may not know that, hey, with just a little bit of help, with a little bit of water and using water correct, then this is what we can bring back. And having that, is super important.
Exactly. Julie, having now be at the recently retired, maybe stepping back a little, reflecting a little, I'm super curious related to this question. What have you seen as you're like, now that was a really successful approach to this restoration, or that sure as heck didn't work? Where do you feel like the best opportunities and maybe perhaps the biggest pitfalls lie in this effort?
Yeah, let me I'll get to your question in 1 second, but I'm going to respond to something that Giselle said. So I love this idea of people, young people, old people getting down to the river, because people want to get involved. When you say restoration, people want to do something, and they want to make a difference. And right now, I think sometimes the efforts that they're making, they might go pick up trash, or they might remove exotic species. I would love to see a shift so that they're engaging in the restoration process by, say, learning about functions or measuring function. Get down there with a thermometer and measure how much the trees are cooling the air, or understand which plants are removing nitrogen. I think that having more of an educational component to those that are involved in the restoration process, as opposed to just going in and removing some plant, that'd be wonderful to see. But to answer your question, something that Osvaldo said was really important, that when you're talking about restoration, it's important to restore not just species, and I've also not just species, but the processes that go with those species. Are these species that require shallow groundwater, low salinity, or a flood pulse, or what you really need to know something about the members of your community that you're trying to restore. And if you can restore them, if you can raise the groundwater table up, reduce the salinity through a flood pulse, then maybe go in and remove some of the plants that were there and allow reseed and allow something new to come in. If you can't restore those processes, I still see there is some disconnect between trying to establish what was there in the past without restoring the processes that allowed them to be there in the first place. And that's where you get into this logjam of, oh, we're failing to restore what we needed to, but we're going to kill the ones that are there now. And you end up with a worse situation. It's like you've killed things, but you haven't brought back what you wanted to. So sometimes it's easier to kill than to restore. So, just make sure so basically, if you can't restore what was there before, appreciate what will live and survive there is basically what I'd like to see happen.
Jenny, I want to go to you next, and I'm curious from, you've had the scope of your work is being able to, support very diverse projects. And accordingly, I think you get to see as a funder, what worked and what didn't. Where would you say that you, kind of similar question to what I asked Julie, where do you what have you seen as like, that's where we're getting the bang for our buck, or vice or contrary, that just is repeatedly not working?
I've been trying to think of a good example of repeatedly not working, and I'll maybe by the time I'm done talking, I'll come up with something. I think the thing that's kind of neat about riparian restoration in particular is that on one hand, there's some really low technology, simple, straightforward things that you can do, especially if you have water. Like if you have a little bit of water, you can stick some cottonwood and willow poles into the ground and they take root and they grow. Or you have an erosion problem and you can build some little rock check dams to slow down the erosion and build substrate for plants to start growing. And it can also be hugely, hugely complex, dealing like with things that Osvaldo and his partners are dealing with, international water treaties and major rivers that cross borders and where everybody wants the water and everybody wants more water than there is. I don't know. I feel like thinking about tamarisk, for example, you know, the urge to get rid of tamarisk and to paint tamarisk as a villain and a horrible invasive species that's really bad. I get it on the one hand. On the other hand, wildlife uses tamarisk. There are threatened and endangered species and non-threatened and endangered species that nest in and use it as habitat. And so going in and just taking out all the tamarisk is not really a viable solution. And that's definitely something that I've seen done. Then you end up with, you know, no habitat at all, because if you could snap your fingers and all of a sudden you'd have a lush cottonwood willow gallery forest immediately after removing the tamarisk, that would be great. But unfortunately, it takes some time. So
and Julie,
I think
is
sometimes,
that, sorry to interrupt you, Jenny, but on that note, Julie, is that one of the hated species you were referring to in terms of how we need to change our thinking with them?
Yeah, it's one of the most vilified, and it's actually its perception has gone from, you know, the wonder plant. We brought it in because it had these amazing traits, and it was, you know, it was going to be the savior, and then it eventually shifted, and then now it's kind of the pendulum swung, and I think I see it as a scapegoat. I mean, people are frustrated that we've lost cottonwoods and willows and mesquite forests, and it's easy to blame the salt cedar. And however, we need to go deeper and look at root causes of the change in our plant communities. But yeah, so salt cedar is one. I mean, 7 decades we've been waging war on salt cedar, and studies have come out. A lot of work on, you know, bird habitat, et cetera. And sometimes those studies get ignored, and it's like we need to have this restoration be science driven, and it's not always the case that happens. So yeah, salt cedar is one, but there are many others. I mean, even something like palm trees, if they've migrated out of their canyons like they're doing on the Salt River, people say that, oh, that doesn't belong there. So this idea of where something belongs, like as if it's a fixed construct, I think we need to move away from that and accept that plants move around as we migrate, as we modify the habitat and the environment. Communities are going to shift, and let's just accept that. So yeah, I mean, there are you know, Russian olive. There are all sorts of species that people kind of love to hate. But honestly, I mean, some of the plants, there's assisted migration that people do to aid endangered species, which is wonderful. But some of the plants they're sort of migrating on their own, and if they're coming up from tropical areas, some of them may be more adapted to the temperature extremes or to the changing climate. So we just need to keep a more open mind about and sort of respect that we don't know everything as scientists, and we sometimes think we do. But increasingly, I've become to sort of respect the plants themselves. If they're growing somewhere, there's a reason for that. Let's understand that reason before we just immediately go in and say, no, I think something else should grow here. We don't know everything, and let's give them the benefit of the doubt before we sort of dive in for the kill, I guess is what I'm saying.
So Jenny, please jump back in terms of connecting that, and then Osvaldo, I want to pull you in here after that.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to, what Julie is saying brings up something for me, which is that in the conservation world, we're driven by this idea that wilderness somehow exists, that the land exists somehow without people, and that's just not true. You know, people are part of the landscape, and people change the landscape as we live within that landscape. And it's not to say, I'm not saying, you know, let's go make parking lots everywhere or let's make lawns everywhere, things like that. But I'm not sure what we're trying to get back to in some cases. And in other cases, like buffalo grass is another great example. We're never not going to have buffalo grass in the Sonoran Desert, right? So it's a discussion of how do we live with, how do we live with these things that are now part of our community.
Absolutely. So Osvaldo, pick where you want to jump in here, because I feel like there's core elements of everything that's been said on this topic within your program. So Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with what Julie and Jenny are saying about the approach on restoration. So, yeah, in regard to salt cedar, just to reemphasize, it's more about the hydrological changes that we have caused than by the invasion of the species, right? And in many cases, certainly in many places of the Delta, salt cedar is the only plant that will survive in certain conditions. So it's actually better than it's there because none of the natives will survive under some of the conditions. And so in the emphasis in terms of restoration for me, and I'm very glad that the Raise the River Coalition in the Delta has embraced this idea, is about where can we maintain the natives, right? And in many other areas that are there's not enough resources and water to restore, well, salt cedar is going to be there. Then also we have learned for birds in wildlife, salt cedar supports them. And then even in places where you can maintain like a good stance of cottonwoods and willows, having salt cedar as a secondary species in the understory, it's good as it creates more biomass for species. So yeah, I like this idea of keeping an open mind about that, and then concentrating on what natives, what function do you want to maintain, and then looking at the responses of wildlife and adapt to that. No?
Great. There's a question.
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
I don't remember who said it. I think Julie was talking about the importance of restoring not just, sort of the structure of something, but the function of something. And that's one way in which birds can be really good indicators. It sounds like a cliche, but sort of that canary in a coal mine piece is really true. You can have habitat that looks really, really good, but by using birds or other species as indicators and monitoring populations of those species and their responses, it can help you determine if that biological function is returning.
Yeah, and could I say something too about function as well? Yes, the functional metrics by which we judge restoration success perhaps could be broadened too. Yeah, I mean, using the birds is good, the biota, but also functions like I'd love to see increased focus on the capacity of a restored stand to mitigate climate change. I mean, let's put carbon. I mean, if climate change is the big stressor, looming stressor out there, let's put things like carbon capture, carbon sequestration, factor those into how we're assessing the success of a restoration project.
And I think, well, absolutely. And as one of these other elements, it was mentioned a couple of times, is when you do get the water back in this space, the response by the community and that positive feedback cycle. Giselle, you spoke to it. Osvaldo, with the water back in the Delta in 2014 with that pulse flow, I'll never forget those images of families playing in the river again, and that that generational impact. I think that societal benefit should be factored in as an impact as much as anything else. One question I want to pull in from the audience that came in, and this connects to kind of how I think of our riparian corridors a lot too, in terms of this north-south trending direction, as opposed to efforts trying to create barriers running east to west. How has this change in water resources changed wildlife corridors? How can communities assist in the protection of the wildlife corridors that just naturally follow the ribbons of green of our community? I'll really open that to the whole panel, to whoever wants to jump in on that. I think each of your work touches on it a little differently. Jenny, go for it. I
mean, I think, yeah, there's so many ways. The thing that immediately jumped to mind for me was thinking about the work going on in the Santa Cruz, in downtown Tucson. There's the work that Michael Bogan is doing, monitoring aquatic invertebrates and documenting. He has students studying bird response and all kinds of things. But there are people, it's called, what's the project called? Like Reconciliation Project. Every Sunday morning, people gather at the Santa Cruz River downtown and pick up trash and do plant things and make sure that the water can flow through, like clear out weeds and things like that to let the water move. And I think part of it's like that idea that people are somehow separate from nature. We need to get rid of that and work to build those connections where we feel responsible for the river, which is responsible for us. The rivers give us water to drink. They provide water for the plants, which provide things for us. We need to re-engage and rebuild those senses of responsibility and reciprocity with rivers, which I think will then take us to places where we see opportunities to be a voice for restoring and protecting those corridors.
Makes me think a lot about community science work, and just that data accumulation is really impactful in terms of forming that base of knowledge to make future decisions, and how easy technology is creating these platforms for that community science. Jenny, I know you work, you work with eBird a lot, iNaturalist, and so forth, or volunteering with other programs. Anything any of you other would like to add on that question?
We're just carrying that further. This idea of greenery and nature and riparian ecosystems as providing ecotherapy. I love that phrase. I mean, and doctors are even prescribing going out to nature to increase people's mental health. I mean, and there's tremendous stress and low mental health among some of the young generation that lives in the cities and the elders as well. And so investing in riparian habitat, greenery helps not just the bird life and plant life, but we humans as well. So.
I just want to add too, for being O'odham and thinking about our animals, where Sanavir district is located on the south side of Tucson, and we have I-19, Interstate 19 that goes right through our land, and needing a place for our animals and a safe place for them, and having our HIC done, and even having the water flow again in the Santa Cruz gives them safe places to go and be. And like I mentioned, seeing that huge family of javelinas, those little babies were just adorable. And having that and knowing that they can be there, and also us coexisting with them when we're there using the HIC done in that area. And again, just having a safe place for them. And I think that's super important for us, because when you look at our himatag, our way of life, animals are very much important in our creation. We had buzzard, we had coyote that were there creating humans. And so, we need to take care of them. And again, also too, taking care of the land and being there and, making sure that, we're not stepping in too much as human beings, but again, being able to be there. And, for example, Sanavir District Natural Resources I'm working with them at Don O'odham Community College to have students go out and monitor the flow, and be in these spaces and be in these areas. And, I think that's all very important. And also to making note of wildlife. And also we have a couple hawks that live in the areas. We're talking about birds, and also coyotes and, other animals as well. And it's super important. So I'm glad this is part of the conversation, talking about animals. And especially, like I said, when it relates back to our O'odham cosmology and what they really mean to us.
Yeah, and I fully agree. And one thing I would love to add is that this local connection is essential. No, that this is where it all starts. And at the same time, this is when it might get tricky. No, we need to be able to replicate this at the continental level. No, a lot of these species, especially birds, they are long distance migrants, and it appears that populations have been declining because of mortality during migration. Is the most dangerous time of the year for them. And they need these stopover sites during the migration. And as wetlands and riparian systems have been disappearing, then we see populations declining. No, so in this way, these species and these stopover sites connect us all, no? So we need to be able to plan at the local level, but also at the continental level, and be able to replicate these models, know what's happening in the Santa Cruz with the Tohono O'odham in the Delta, and bring it into scale. So that's a lot of work to do.
Well, I think we've identified some good axes to work along in this conversation. So as to maybe, I want to be able to keep going, but we're going to have to kind of push to a close here. And I'm going to ask each of you kind of the same question, which is, if you don't mind, just give you in a little nutshell, what is one thing that you hope people will take away from this event, or if you happen to participate in the other presentations in this series, zooming out even more. So Julie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I would say, I hope people go away with the idea of hope, that our riparian areas are resilient. If we know what we're doing, use the water wisely, we can restore a lot of the functions that we wish. So I would hope people would just, after this, just go outside, find your favorite tree, learn about that tree, understand her, respect what she's doing, and brainstorm from there.
Yeah, love it. Jenny.
I think Julie, I keep going back to things that you said, but you said that people don't know everything, or I'm paraphrasing. And I think that's true, but what I hope people take away is, I think it's important to recognize that we don't know everything, and that there's so much amazing things that we can learn, and people that we can learn it from, and not just people, but things in nature from which we can learn it. And I kind of hope the same thing. I hope we all find ways to get outside and make those connections. And it doesn't have to be, on a wild and raging river in the middle of far removed from towns, but it could be in the river right underneath I-19 or I-10. There's really amazing things to learn and experience.
Absolutely. Osvaldo.
Oh my God. So much great things have been said, and I've learned a lot. I thank you all for that. And I will say that, yeah, keep in mind now that the rivers are in a way like the veins or the arteries of the earth, right? And they connect mountains with the sea. And many times we forget now that the flow or the water flow is not only for human consumption, but we need to leave some water for nature. And sometimes we forget easily now that water should reach coastal areas and reach the sea. And there's so much richness there. And resiliency, the resiliency for us, for communities, but for nature, depends on that.
Beautiful. Giselle.
I think for me, it would be giving you all cultural awareness and learning a little bit more from my O'odham perspective, and having you understand, as we are the original inhabitants of this land. And I think also too, the fact that, me being part of this conversation is super important, because I feel like Indigenous folks are left out of many conversations. So for me to be in this space with you all and share is super important. And I thank you for this opportunity to be here with you today.
Well, thank you. And thank all of you for your time. When we hit on some really important topics today, and one of the consistencies, especially in those last remarks from all four of you, is an expanded scope of how we think about the challenges we're facing, and thinking outside the box, and not necessarily. And there's a lot of taboo breaking, I think, in what we discussed, and thinking about how we grapple with some of these incredibly weighty trajectories, but looking at novel ways of rethinking the paradigms, and probably breaking a lot of them to get through this. So thank you very much for your time. At this point, I think that concludes the formal panel part of this evening. And I would just like to, to really thank all the behind the scenes people that put this together, the air staff, the Water Resource Research Center team, the Udall Center, and a special thanks to all the participants that joined us. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Sharon Megdal, Director of the Water Resources Researcher Center and co-host of this series, to provide some parting thoughts with this as the final contribution to what has been a really fantastic and important series. So thank you, Sharon.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, all you wonderful speakers and panelists. It really was inspiring, and I'm very glad that you all shared your knowledge and insights. And I just wanted to say that from the perspective of the Water Resources Research Center, we're just very pleased to have been part of this 6-part series, working with Kathy and the team, the expert team, bringing these webinars to you flawlessly, and Andrea Gerlach, who's out of town from the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy. So we're just pleased to be part of it. We want to thank all of you and all of the attendees for participating. And if I might, Ben, I want to talk about my takeaways, if I might, from today, because a couple of expressions. This was a series, Water Solutions for Our Warmer World. So, of course, it focused on water, and of course we know water is life, and so we've seen pictures of it. My background picture is of the Gila River Indian Community Mar 5 recharge site from the spring of 2019, and if you want to see what water does and brings life, read my reflections that I issued last week, because we went on a field trip there just October 22nd, and the life that's there is just amazing. So water is life. We know that, but we have to remember that. The term coexist, was it Giselle or somebody said the word coexist? And I find I use that word a lot. We have to figure out how to coexist with our environment and all be able to thrive. And then somebody else said, there's a lot of work to do. And I think that might be the best thing to say, is that this is the end of a 6-part series, but there's so much work to do. And we certainly look forward to working with many of you as we tackle these challenges. So thank you. And Kathy, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, everyone. This actually has been an incredible series, and we're very pleased with everybody who's participated throughout the entire six item series. We're really happy with the engagement of both our panelists and our audience. This has been a bit of an experiment for the new Arizona Institutes for Resilience. Our efforts here have been both to bring interdisciplinary panels of people together to talk about important issues, and to engage to the extent we can outside the university and across a broad array of other entities and interests. So we do look forward to your feedback. This has been a great experiment from our perspective. We're interested in knowing whether we should do more of this or whether we should do it differently. But thank you very much, Ben. You did a great job with moderating, and we're very pleased that all of you chose to join us today. Thanks very much, and I hope you have a great evening.